March 23, 1945, Western Germany, 7 kilometers from the Rhine. The bullet entered Heinrich Bohme's chest with a sound like fabric tearing, a wet, intimate whisper that seemed impossibly quiet for something that would change everything. He was 23 years old. The cold mud beneath him smelled of iron and decomposing leaves, and as he pressed his hand against the wound, feeling the warm blood pulse between his fingers with each heartbeat, he thought not of death, but of his brother Karl, who had died 18 months earlier, in a camp whose name Heinrich still could not pronounce without his throat closing. The sky above was the color of dirty dishwater. Someone was screaming, not him, someone else, and the sound seemed to come from very far away, though the man was perhaps 10 meters distant. Heinrich's breathing made a whistling sound, a small tea kettle in his chest, and he understood with perfect clarity that he was drowning on dry land. What he did not know, could not know, was that this moment, this collision of metal and flesh in the dying days of a dying war, would become the hinge upon which his entire understanding of the world would turn. Everything he had been taught to believe, every careful lie the propaganda ministry had constructed about the nature of the enemy and the meaning of loyalty, would shatter in a warm room with clean sheets and the improbable kindness of strangers. But that revelation lay ahead. For now there was only the mud and the whistling and the growing cold. The education of fear. Heinrich Bohme had learned about Americans the way most Germans of his generation had learned about them, through carefully curated hatred. In the Hitler youth meetings of his adolescence, in the newsreels that played before films, in the speeches that crackled from the Volksempfänger radio in his family's modest apartment in Stuttgart, a particular image had been constructed with the precision of a watchmaker assembling a timepiece. Americans, he had been taught, were mongrels, a bastardized race of capitalists and criminals, descended from the refuse of Europe. They were soft, made weak by their decadent jazz music and their worship of money. They were simultaneously inferior in their mongrel bloodlines and terrifying in their mechanical efficiency, a paradox that no one seemed to notice or question. Most importantly, they were cruel. The propaganda films showed American soldiers shooting prisoners, laughing as they did so. The images were grainy, almost certainly fabricated, but repetition has a way of making even the impossible seem inevitable. By the spring of 1945, Heinrich had additional reasons to fear what capture might bring. His brother Karl had been a guard at Stalag 3B, one of the largest prisoner of war camps for Soviet soldiers in Germany. Karl had written home twice, stilted letters that said nothing about what he did, and everything about what he felt, which was a kind of hollow horror that seemed to echo from the page. The second letter had arrived in October of 1943. There would be no third letter. Karl had died of typhus in the camp, one of thousands, though the official notification had been maddeningly vague about the circumstances. Heinrich did not know, no one had told him, no one would tell him, that Soviet prisoners in German camps died at a rate of nearly 60%. That of the 5.7 million Soviet soldiers captured by Germany, approximately 3.3 million would never return home. That in camps like Stalag 3B, prisoners were given starvation rations, denied medical care, worked to death in mines and factories, shot for the smallest infractions or for no infractions at all. But Heinrich knew his brother had been there. He knew Karl had been part of that machinery, even if he didn't understand the scope of it. And he knew, with the certainty of someone whose entire world had been constructed on the principle of reciprocal violence, that if the Americans captured him, they would extract payment for every crime Germany had committed. This was the calculus of his fear. His brother's death, plus Germany's crimes, equals his own inevitable torture and execution. It was a reasonable calculation, given everything he had been taught. It was also completely wrong. The breaking. The unit had been trying to reach the Rhine for 6 days. Heinrich's company, what remained of it, had been ordered to delay the American advance, a polite military phrase for die slowly while accomplishing nothing. They were children and old men now, the real army having been ground to dust in Russia and France. Heinrich, at 23, was among the oldest. The boy next to him, Franz, was 16 and still had acne scattered across his jaw like buckshot. The Americans had better weapons, better food, better everything. They moved with the casual confidence of men who knew the war was over, who were simply filling in the last terrible pages of a book whose ending had already been written. The German defenders moved like ghosts, haunting the ruins of their own country. The bullet caught Heinrich during a chaotic skirmish in a bombed-out village whose name he never learned. One moment he was running between the skeleton of a church and the collapsed wall of what had been a bakery. He could still smell the phantom scent of bread somehow, after all the burning. The next moment the tearing sound, the mud, the whistling breath. Franz dragged him into a cellar. The boy's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his rifle. "You're going to be fine," Franz kept saying, the lie so obvious that neither of them bothered to acknowledge it. Heinrich could feel the cold spreading from his chest outward, like ink dropped into water. He had heard of pneumonia, of course. Everyone had. But he had never understood that it could begin this quickly, that an injury combined with cold and wet and exhaustion could invite infection with such terrible efficiency. By nightfall, the fever had started. By dawn, he was coughing up blood. The Americans found them on the morning of the 25th. Heinrich was barely conscious. He remembers the sound of boots on the cellar stairs, remembers Franz's young voice cracking as he called out their surrender in broken English. "We give up. We give up." He remembers thinking with perfect clarity that he was about to die, that they would shoot him in the cellar, that it would be quick if he was lucky and slow if he was not. He remembers a face appearing above him, a young American soldier, maybe 20 years old, with red hair and freckles. The soldier looked at Heinrich's chest wound, at the blood on his lips, and said something in English. Another soldier appeared. They were talking rapidly, gesturing. One of them pulled out a canteen and held it to Heinrich's lips. The water was cold and tasted faintly of metal. They did not shoot him. This was the first impossible thing. The arithmetic of disbelief. The hospital, if you could call it that, had been set up in a requisitioned German factory. Heinrich would later learn that the Americans called these facilities cage hospitals, temporary medical stations for prisoners of war who required immediate treatment. The name suggested imprisonment, but the reality suggested something else entirely. They carried him in on a stretcher. He was conscious enough to notice details. The efficiency of the movement, the way the medics communicated in quick shorthand, the absence of cruelty. No one struck him. No one mocked him. They simply carried him, as if he were a person rather than an enemy. And this impossible gentleness was somehow more disorienting than violence would have been. The receiving doctor was a captain named Morrison. Heinrich would learn the name later, would remember it for the rest of his life. Morrison was 42 years old, had a practice in Philadelphia before the war, had 3 children, whose photographs he kept in his breast pocket. None of this mattered to Heinrich in that moment. What mattered was that Morrison took one look at the chest wound, at Heinrich's labored breathing, at the fever-bright eyes, and made a decision. Get him into surgery, now. Not process him, not register him, not wait until we finish with the Americans. Now. Heinrich was operated on within 2 hours of his capture. 2 hours. The bullet was removed, the wound cleaned and sutured, antibiotics administered, sulfa drugs, precious and rationed, given to an enemy soldier without hesitation. The surgery took 90 minutes. Morrison would later note in his log that the patient would have died within 24 hours without intervention, that the pneumonia was already advancing rapidly, that the combination of chest trauma and respiratory infection would have been unsurvivable without immediate treatment. In Germany, in those final months of the war, you could die waiting 3 days for a doctor. You could die because there were no antibiotics left, because the supply lines had collapsed, because the young doctors were all dead or captured and the old doctors were overwhelmed. You could die because your life had been calculated according to some bureaucratic hierarchy of value and you had been found insufficient. In the American prisoner of war hospital, Heinrich Bohme was treated immediately because he was dying. The arithmetic was that simple and that impossible to comprehend. The room when Heinrich woke from the surgery, he thought he had died, and that heaven was a confusion of white sheets and bright lights. The room was warm. This was the detail that penetrated first before anything else. Warmth. Not the grudging warmth of a fire that would burn out by morning, not the shared body heat of men packed into a frozen bunker. Actual, sustained, reliable warmth from radiators that functioned, from a building that had walls without holes, from a system that treated heat as a right rather than a privilege. The bed had clean sheets. They were thin, military issue, nothing luxurious, but they were clean. They smelled of soap and bleach. Heinrich ran his hand across the fabric and felt his eyes fill with tears, which embarrassed him until he looked around and saw that half the other men in the ward were crying too, silently into their clean pillows. There were 12 beds in the room, arranged in 2 neat rows. All the patients were German prisoners. Some were surgical cases like Heinrich. Others suffered from diseases: typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis. A boy who looked about 15 had lost his left arm and kept reaching for it in his sleep, his right hand grasping at empty air. An older man, perhaps 40, had been shot through the jaw and couldn't speak, but his eyes tracked everything with fierce intelligence. The nurses came through every 4 hours. They checked temperatures, changed bandages, administered medications. They were efficient but not unkind. One of them, a woman from Wisconsin named Lieutenant Patterson, had learned enough German to offer basic comfort. "You're going to be fine," she told Heinrich on the second day, adjusting his IV drip with practiced competence. "The infection is responding to the sulfa. Your breathing is improving." Heinrich tried to speak, couldn't, tried again. "Why?" He finally managed. Patterson looked at him with something between puzzlement and pity. "Why what? Why are you saving me?" It was a genuine question. Everything he understood about the world suggested that this should not be happening. He was the enemy. His country had started a war that had killed tens of millions. His brother had been part of a system that had starved Soviet prisoners by the hundreds of thousands. He himself had shot at American soldiers just days ago. The logic of reciprocal violence suggested that he should be dying in a ditch somewhere, not recovering in a warm room with clean sheets and antibiotics. Patterson considered the question. "Because you're sick," she said finally, as if the answer were obvious. "And we're doctors and nurses. That's what we do." The simplicity of it was staggering. The evidence accumulates. Over the following days, Heinrich began to catalog the impossible things because he could not quite believe they were happening and needed to create a mental inventory to convince himself of their reality. Impossible thing number 1, the food. 3 meals a day, not starvation rations, not watery soup and moldy bread, but actual food. Breakfast was oatmeal with sugar and powdered milk, toast, sometimes eggs. Lunch was soup and sandwiches. Dinner was whatever the field kitchen had prepared for the American troops, usually some variation of meat, potatoes, vegetables, bread. The portions were not enormous, but they were sufficient. Heinrich had not felt full in months, maybe years. Now he felt full every day. He learned that American soldiers ate roughly 4,000 calories per day. German soldiers, by late 1944, were lucky to get 2,000. German prisoners in Soviet camps received as little as 500 to 1,000 calories daily, which was why they died at such horrific rates. But here, in an American prisoner of war hospital, Heinrich received approximately the same rations as the American medical staff. This was not supposed to happen. Impossible thing number 2, the medicine. Heinrich had pneumonia, serious pneumonia, the kind that killed. In Germany, he would have been given aspirin if there was any available, told to rest, and quietly expected to die. Here he was given sulfa drugs, the new antibiotics that had been discovered less than a decade ago and were still relatively rare. The Americans had enough of these drugs to give them to enemy prisoners. Dr. Morrison explained it to him one afternoon in careful German that suggested weeks spent with a phrase book. The sulfanilamide interrupts the bacterial reproduction cycle. It doesn't kill the bacteria directly, but it prevents them from multiplying, which gives your immune system time to eliminate the infection. He spoke as if Heinrich were a medical student rather than an enemy soldier. as if knowledge were something to be shared rather than hoarded. In America, Morrison continued, we believe that medicine should help everyone. It doesn't matter if you're German or American, soldier or civilian. If you're sick and we can help you, we should help you. That's what it means to be a doctor. Heinrich didn't know what to say to this. The propaganda had prepared him for many things: American barbarism, American greed, American racial hatred, but not for American idealism. Not for the possibility that his enemies might actually believe in the principles they claimed to fight for. Impossible thing number 3, the conversations. The American staff talked to the prisoners, not interrogations. There were separate officers who handled that, and those conversations were professional and correct, but not warm. These were just conversations. Small talk. How are you feeling? Where are you from? What did you do before the war? A young orderly from Ohio named Private Jennings learned that Heinrich had worked in a bookstore in Stuttgart. No kidding, Jennings said. I wanted to open a bookstore before the war, just couldn't afford it. What was your favorite book to sell? It was such an absurdly normal question. They were in the middle of a war zone. Heinrich was a prisoner. Jennings was part of the occupying army. Heinrich's country had killed hundreds of thousands of Americans, had allied with Japan in attacking Pearl Harbor, had nearly destroyed Western civilization. And Jennings wanted to know about his favorite book. Thomas Mann, Heinrich said finally. Die Buddenbrooks. Never read it, Jennings admitted. Any good? Yes. Maybe I'll pick it up after the war, if they translate it. The casual assumption that there would be an after the war, that both of them would survive to read books and have normal lives. It was dizzying. The collapse of certainty. By the end of the first week, Heinrich could sit up without help. By the end of the second, he could walk short distances with assistance. The pneumonia was receding. He could feel it in his breathing, which had gone from a painful wheeze to something approaching normal. His chest wound was healing cleanly, no infection. Dr. Morrison pronounced himself satisfied with the progress. You're young and strong, Morrison said. Another few weeks and you'll be fit for transfer to a regular POW camp. The thought of transfer should have frightened him, but by then Heinrich had begun to understand that the American prisoner of war camps were not death camps. Men who were transferred there continued to write letters. The Red Cross had access. The conditions were basic but not brutal. You could survive there. You would survive there. This understanding represented the complete collapse of everything he had been taught. It happened gradually, this collapse. Not in a single moment of revelation, but through the accumulation of small dissonances, each one cracking the edifice of propaganda a little further. The warm room, the clean sheets, the food, the medicine, the conversations, the absence of torture, of cruelty, of the vengeful violence he had been certain would come. One night, unable to sleep, Heinrich lay in his bed and tried to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had been taught to expect. The exercise was futile. There was no reconciliation possible. Either the propaganda had been lies, or his own senses were deceiving him. And his senses were very clear. He was alive, he was healing, and his enemies were saving his life with the same efficiency and care they would give to one of their own. The boy in the next bed, his name was Dieter, he was 17. He had lost his arm to shrapnel near Cologne, was crying softly. This happened sometimes at night. The crying was usually about pain or fear or grief, but this time it sounded different. Dieter, Heinrich whispered. They gave me chocolate, Dieter said. His voice was thick. Private Johnson gave me chocolate from his ration. I told him he didn't have to, and he said... Dieter's voice broke. He said his kid brother is about my age, and he'd want someone to give his brother chocolate if he was hurt and scared. Heinrich didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The chocolate was a small thing, meaningless in the larger scheme of the war. But it was also everything. It was proof that the enemy was human, which meant all the careful dehumanization of the past 12 years had been a lie. We were wrong, Dieter said into the darkness, about everything. We were wrong. Yes, Heinrich said. It was the first time he had admitted it aloud. The revelation of statistics. Dr. Morrison visited Heinrich regularly during the recovery period. Morrison seemed to enjoy having someone who could discuss ideas, who had read books, who could think beyond the immediate present. They talked about many things: literature, philosophy, the nature of war. But one conversation stood above the others, burned itself into Heinrich's memory with such force that he could recall every word decades later. It began with a simple question. Heinrich, emboldened by weeks of kind treatment, asked Morrison about his brother Karl, about the camps for Soviet prisoners. "Did you know," Heinrich asked carefully, "what was happening in the camps?" Morrison's face went carefully neutral. "What do you think was happening?" "I don't know. My brother worked at one. He died there, but he never told us. He never said what it was like." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but very firm. "We knew some things. Not everything, not at first. But by 1943, we had intelligence reports. We knew that Soviet prisoners in German camps were dying at extraordinary rates. We knew they were being starved, denied medical care, worked to death. We knew that of approximately 5.7 million Soviet prisoners captured by Germany, more than 3 million had died." The numbers hit Heinrich like physical blows. 3 million, more than half. He couldn't finish the sentence. "That's genocide," Morrison said quietly. "That's deliberate mass murder through neglect and brutality. That's what your brother was part of, whether he wanted to be or not, whether he understood it or not." Heinrich felt something break inside his chest, but this time it wasn't physical. "Then why?" he asked desperately. "Why are you saving me? If you knew what we did, why didn't you let me die? Why didn't you shoot me in that cellar?" Morrison looked at him with something that might have been compassion. "Because that's not who we are. Because revenge doesn't heal anything. Because the only way to end this cycle of violence is for someone to decide that every human life has value, even the lives of our enemies." He paused. "And because you're not your brother, you're not responsible for decisions you didn't make, for crimes you didn't commit. You're just a young man who got shot and got sick, and I'm a doctor, and doctors save lives. It's that simple." "It's not simple," Heinrich said. "No," Morrison agreed, "it's not. But the alternative, treating you the way you treated Soviet prisoners, that would make us the same as you, and we're not the same. We're trying to be better. Trying to be better. Not claiming to be perfect, not denying their own capacity for violence. The American bombing campaigns had killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. But trying, making an effort, choosing to save an enemy's life because life itself had value. It was the most radical idea Heinrich had ever encountered. The weight of gratitude. By the end of the 4th week, Heinrich was well enough to be transferred to a standard prisoner of war camp. The chest wound had healed completely. The pneumonia was gone. Morrison pronounced him recovered, signed the necessary paperwork, and shook his hand. "Good luck," Morrison said. "After the war, you should write to me. I'd like to know how things turn out for you." The casual assumption that Heinrich would survive the war, would have a life worth living afterward, would be someone worth corresponding with. It represented a profound act of hope that Heinrich could barely comprehend. On his last day in the hospital ward, Heinrich tried to express his gratitude to Lieutenant Patterson. He had been working on the words for days, but when the moment came, they felt inadequate. "Thank you," he said in careful English, "for saving my life, for everything." Patterson smiled. "You're welcome. Stay well." "I will never forget this," Heinrich said. "Never." "You gave me back my life." "Then use it well," Patterson said simply. "That's all we ask." The regular POW camp was located in Belgium. The conditions were basic: barracks, barbed wire, guards, but the treatment remained correct. Adequate food, medical care when needed, no torture, no executions, mail service that actually delivered letters. You could survive here. You could wait out the war's end and imagine a future. Heinrich spent his months in captivity reading everything he could find in English, determined to understand this strange country that had defeated his homeland not just through superior firepower, but through a completely different understanding of human worth. He read about American history, about the Declaration of Independence, and its radical claim that all men are created equal. He read about the American Civil War and the centuries-long struggle to make that promise real. He read about imperfect America, violent America, racist America, but also about America that believed in improvement, in second chances, in the possibility of becoming better than you were. When the war ended in May of 1945, Heinrich was repatriated to Germany. Stuttgart was rubble. His family's apartment building no longer existed. His parents had survived miraculously and wept when they saw him. They had received notification that he was missing in action and had assumed he was dead. "The Americans saved me," Heinrich told them. "I was dying, and they saved my life." His father, who had spent the war years as a minor bureaucrat in a government office, shook his head in disbelief. "But why? After everything?" "Because they're better than we were," Heinrich said. "Because they chose to be." The Long Echo. In 1952, 7 years after the war's end, Heinrich Bohme emigrated to the United States. He settled in Philadelphia, where Dr. Morrison helped him find work and navigate the immigration system. He learned English fluently, married an American woman named Sarah, had 2 children. He opened a small bookstore just as he had dreamed before the war destroyed everything. He never forgot the warm room, the clean sheets, the medicine that saved his life. He never forgot Lieutenant Patterson's simple statement, "Because you're sick, and we're doctors and nurses, that's what we do." He never forgot the chocolate that Private Johnson gave to Dieter, or the conversations about books, or Dr. Morrison's gentle insistence that every human life has value. In 1968, Heinrich attended an anti-Vietnam War rally in Philadelphia. He held a sign that read, "I was your enemy, and you saved my life." A reporter asked him about the sign's meaning, and Heinrich told his story, the mud and the bullet and the fear, the warm room and the antibiotics, and the impossible kindness. The reporter wrote an article. Other veterans read it. Some wrote letters. One letter came from a man named Frank Johnson, who had been a private in the medical corps during World War II. "I think I remember you," Johnson wrote, "or maybe it was your friend. I gave a lot of kids chocolate. They all looked so scared and so young. I'm glad you made it home. I'm glad you got to have a life." Heinrich wrote back. They corresponded for years. When Johnson died in 1979, Heinrich attended the funeral and told Johnson's children that their father had helped teach him that enemies could become friends, that violence could give way to healing, that the choice to be kind in the face of cruelty was the most powerful force in the world. "Your father gave me chocolate when I was 17 and terrified," Heinrich told them, conflating himself with Dieter in his memory, because by then the 2 experiences had merged. It was such a small thing, but it was also everything. It was proof that I was still human, that the war hadn't destroyed that. Epilogue, The Arithmetic of Hope. Heinrich Bohme died in 2003 at the age of 81. His children found among his papers a letter he had written but never sent to Dr. Morrison, who had passed away in 1991. The letter said, in part, "I have spent 58 years trying to understand what happened to me in that warm room in March of 1945. I have read philosophy and theology, history and psychology, trying to comprehend how you could treat your enemy with such care when revenge would have been so much easier, so much more justified. I think I finally understand. It was not about me. It was never about me. It was about who you chose to be. You chose to be the doctor who saves lives rather than the soldier who takes them. You chose to see me as a human being rather than an enemy. You chose to believe that the way to end the cycle of violence is to refuse to participate in it, even when participation would have been understandable. You taught me that there is an arithmetic of hope that outweighs the arithmetic of vengeance. For every act of cruelty, there can be an act of kindness. For every life taken, there can be a life saved. For every moment of hatred, there can be a moment of grace. I was your enemy, and you gave me back my life. I have tried to use it well. I have tried to be, in my small way, as brave as you were, choosing kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, humanity over ideology. Thank you seems insufficient. Thank you doesn't cover the enormity of the gift. But thank you is all I have, so I say it again, across the years and across the distance. Thank you. Thank you for the warm room, the clean sheets, the medicine, the food, the conversations, the chocolate, the simple human dignity of being treated as a person rather than a thing. Thank you for teaching me that redemption is possible, that enemies can become friends, that the way we treat each other in the worst moments defines who we really are. Thank you for saving my life, not just my physical life, but my soul, my capacity to hope, my belief in human goodness. I was your enemy, and you gave me everything. The letter was unsigned, unfinished, but the message was complete. In a world constructed on the principle of reciprocal violence, where every injury demanded repayment, where every crime justified revenge, a group of American doctors and nurses had chosen differently. They had chosen to save lives instead of taking them, to offer healing instead of inflicting harm, to believe in the possibility of redemption even when redemption seemed impossible. It was a small choice, repeated thousands of times in dozens of hospitals for tens of thousands of prisoners. But small choices accumulate. They become the difference between a world defined by vengeance and a world defined by hope. Heinrich Bohme lived his life as evidence of that difference. He was proof that the enemy could become a friend, that the soldier trying to kill you in March could thank you for saving his life in May, that the arithmetic of hope could sometimes outweigh the arithmetic of hate. He was proof that when someone asks, "Why are you saving me?" the answer can be as simple and as revolutionary as, "Because you're sick and we're doctors." That's what we do. In the spring of 1945, in a requisition factory somewhere in Western Germany, a young German soldier named Heinrich Bohme lay in a warm room with clean sheets and thought about miracles. He lived another 58 years, long enough to understand that the miracle wasn't the medicine or the surgery or even the food. The miracle was the choice, repeated over and over by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, to see their enemy as human. That was the only miracle that mattered. That was the only one that could change the world.